Have you ever knit something out of wool yarn and then washed it only to have it shrink to a miniature size? Maybe you've avoided wool because it's so easy to shrink. Or maybe you're looking for an easy care yarn to use for gifts or charity items when you don't want to burden the recipient with something they have to hand wash. If you've ever dreamed of working with wool yarn without all the fuss, then keep on watching to find out what's so super about Superwash wool. Hi everybody, and welcome back to U University. I'm Dr. Kelly. Today's topic is Superwash wool, and I'll be talking about what it is, its benefits, and its drawbacks. So let's get right into it. So first, a definition. Superwash wool is wool that has been treated in a way that allows it to be washed in the washing machine. Until about 50 years ago, most wool yarn required hand washing. Although people loved using it because of its warmth, texture, and natural fiber, they didn't always choose wool yarn because they didn't want to have to hand wash every single item they made with it. And this is especially true when making baby items, which have to be washed frequently, or gifts, where the recipient might not know how to properly care for a wool item. You might be wondering why regular wool requires hand washing. Why can't we just throw it into the washing machine? Well, it has to do with the small scales that cover the surface of individual wool fibers. I talked about the structure of wool in my video a couple of weeks ago on how yarn blooms, which I'll link down below if you haven't seen it and want to check it out. So as a review, each individual hair on a sheep has small scales all along its surface, and these scales can open and close in response to heat and moisture. When wool fiber gets wet, those scales swing open, and this opening is enhanced even more when the water is hot. These scales are what makes wool felt. When they open up in the presence of moisture and heat, agitation tangles these scales together. The individual hairs are pulled more closely together, which meshes the scales together even more. The hairs get so tightly drawn together that the overall area will shrink 25 to 30% in both directions. At the same time, the fabric gets denser and denser as the wool fibers become tangled together forever. And that's how we turn wool into felt. Now, sometimes we felt an item on purpose. We knit or crochet or weave a wool item larger than we want it, then immerse it in hot water and agitate it in order to make it shrink and thicken up. For example, in this picture, you can see a knit hat in its original condition at the bottom, and then after felting at the top. I think you can easily see that it shrunk quite a bit, and the knit fabric got thicker and denser. But sometimes we might accidentally throw a wool garment into the washer and it gets ruined. It shrinks up and felts, and then it doesn't fit anymore, and it's basically trashed. Once something is felted, it's not reversible. And yes, I've seen the products and hacks like hair conditioner that are supposed to fix a felted sweater. Well, they might work to loosen up the fibers enough to eventually stretch it so it's wearable. But if it's really felted, you're still going to have a sweater that's made out of the thick, dense, felted material. Nothing is going to bring it back to its original state where you can see the individual stitches and the knit material is naturally stretchy. So if your wool sweater is shrunk, you're not going to be able to fix it and make it the way it was. For this reason, consumers wanted knitwear that would be machine washable, especially since the 1950s when domestic washing machines gained in popularity. And this is why synthetic fibers like polyester became so popular, because they were so easy to care for. In Australia, where merino wool was and is an important economic product, companies were highly motivated to develop a process that would make wool impervious to the felting process, so that wool fabrics would remain competitive with synthetic fabrics in the market. Research promoting the use of wool was supported by the Australian government, which created the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization in 1949 and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars establishing wool textile laboratories in several Australian cities. Making wool washable requires pre-shrinking and smoothing out the microscopic scales that cover each individual wool fiber. That way they don't open up when they get wet and catch on each other and become tangled, therefore turning into felt. The first method for shrink-proofing wool involved application of a smooth resin to the wool yarn, which reduced felting. This treatment was called Cyrofix, and it was applied commercially to socks starting in 1953. However, it never became widespread because the process involved a flammable solvent. So research continued with the goal of finding other methods. One subsequent technique was the permanganate salt, or G8 process, which was applied to knitwear and woven fabric. And it's still used today by manufacturers to reduce pilling, which is that formation of unsightly balls of fiber on the surface of garments that make your clothes look worn and ratty. But one of the drawbacks of the G8 process was its corrosive effect on machinery. So obviously, alternative methods were still sought after. Finally, a viable method of making wool washable was developed in the mid-1960s by the Australian Wool Corporation. The treatment is based on a two-stage process. The first stage involves an oxidizing pre-treatment using either chlorine or sulfuric acid. This is followed in a second stage by the application of a polymer. The major method subsequently developed and still in widespread use today is called the Hercosset process, which was patented by a subsidiary of the DuPont company called Hercules Inc. in April 1967. The patent describes a process involving pre-treatment of the wool with liquid chlorine for 10 to 15 seconds. This chlorination modifies the surface of the wool fiber so that those microscopic scales are removed and the fiber is smoother. This is an essential pre-treatment because next, a solution called Hercosset 125 is applied. Hercosset 125 is a water-soluble, nylon-based resin that is spread all over the surface of the wool fiber, which smooths it out even more after the chlorine treatment. This resin is highly absorbent, meaning that treated wool retains its ability to absorb moisture. But the surface scales are eliminated and covered with resin so that friction of the fibers rubbing against each other doesn't cause felting. You can think of it as a very thin plastic skin over each fiber that masks the surface scales so they can no longer interlock. The Hercosset resin can't be washed off or worn off. It's held in place permanently by chemical bonds. So this is the traditional process that creates machine washable superwash wool. And this has been very appealing to consumers who are buying finished wool products as well as wool yarn for hand knitters, crocheters, and weavers. Superwash wool has become popular because we don't have to worry about laundering our finished objects so delicately. A lot of crafters are perfectly willing and probably prefer to hand wash their handmade items. But it might be a different story when you're making something for a non-knitter who would forget to hand wash their item or who wouldn't want to go through the hassle of hand washing it and then they throw it in the washer and it gets ruined. This actually happened to me many years ago. I knit a beautiful cabled scarf for a coworker, and a few months later she threw it in the washing machine and it felted. She just forgot that I told her that it had to be hand washed. Or you might be knitting or crocheting for a charity that requires all donations to be machine washable. Another popular use for superwash wool is for making baby items. New parents usually don't want the bother of hand washing their baby's things, especially when they have to be washed constantly. So superwash wool has become very popular because of its ease of care. But you should be aware that superwash wool does have some characteristics that are different from those of non-treated wool. A lot of the natural properties of wool stem from the fiber structure, including those little microscopic scales that comprise the cuticle, which covers the outside of the fiber core. So let's talk about these characteristics of untreated wool and superwash wool. So first, there's durability. The superwash process actually increases the strength and durability of wool fibers. Now, wool is not a super strong fiber in the first place, and you can see that if you try to break a piece of wool. This is some non-superwash wool, and it's super easy to break it. Now, this is some superwash wool, and while you can still break it, you can feel that it takes more to pull it apart. So that microscopic resin adds a layer of strength to the superwash yarn. And another part of the durability is abrasion resistance. Superwash wool is much more resistant to abrasion because that's exactly what the whole superwash process is designed to eliminate. Natural wool will pill and it will irreversibly shrink and felt. Superwash wool is less prone to pilling and it is practically impossible to shrink or felt it. So overall, superwash treatment creates a harder wearing yarn. Okay, the second characteristic is fiber absorbency. Wool is an extremely absorbent fiber and can easily absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without feeling damp. Superwash wool is very absorbent as well, and this actually facilitates and accelerates the dyeing process. With superwash wool, the dye uptake is usually much faster, and the end product is yarn with more vivid and bright colors. So the dyeing process is easier with superwash wool because of its absorbency. All right, third, insulation. Wool is really good at temperature regulation because it protects the body in both cold and warm conditions. Wool absorbs moisture and naturally wicks it away from the body, keeping a layer of dry air next to the skin, which in turn helps to hold in body heat. This is why wool is a great protection against hypothermia in cold weather. But wool also protects the skin against hot weather as well. A thin layer of wool absorbs and wicks away perspiration and keeps that dry air next to the skin, so the body feels cooler. This is why wool clothing is worn throughout desert regions of the world where it's hot during the day and cool at night. Now, the superwash process does change things a bit here. The moisture wicking properties of natural wool are destroyed during the superwash process. The reason why wool can be wet but not feel wet is because of the cuticle scales. Remember that when wool gets wet, those scales open up, which plumps up the yarn and creates pockets of air, and air is a very good insulator. But when you don't have those cuticle scales, you lose a lot of the natural insulation. So superwash isn't going to be as good at temperature regulation as natural wool. And it won't be as warm for sweaters or other cold weather garments. And it won't keep you as cool in light layers during the summer. So the superwash process really messes with the insulating characteristics of wool. Okay, number 4, resilience. Each natural wool fiber is a molecular coil, making the fiber remarkably elastic. Each fiber acts like a coiled spring, which elongates when it's extended and then retracts when it's released. And this molecular crimp allows wool fibers to be stretched and bounce back to their original shape. This is one of the hallmark characteristics of wool that makes it so easy to work with, its natural elasticity. The superwash process does affect this property of wool. The Herkesset process increases the yarn's elongation, meaning that it will stretch out but not spring back as much. And this is why items made out of superwash yarn tend to grow. Garments like sweaters and hats have the tendency to stretch out and sag when they are washed. You might be surprised at how huge an item can be when it gets wet. I've heard dozens of people talking about sweaters they've made out of superwash wool that grew 2 sizes when they were washed. And this is because the wool loses some of its elasticity during the superwash process. Now, to counteract this, a lot of times you'll see nylon blended with superwash wool because the nylon not only increases the strength of the yarn, but it also improves elasticity. Nylon has good elasticity, so it can boost the yarn's resilience when mixed with superwash wool. And that's why a lot of sock yarns and other yarns are made out of a blend of superwash wool and nylon. So yeah, just be careful about making something like a sweater out of 100% superwash wool because it might not turn out the way you planned. Okay, the fifth characteristic is luster. Natural wool doesn't have a lot of luster or shine to it, although this does vary by sheep breed. Some breeds like Cotswold and Wensleydale have more lustrous and shiny wool, whereas others like Cheviot and Merino have wool that is more matte looking. The superwash process tends to affect this attribute of wool. Superwash yarn has a more lustrous appearance than untreated wool. This may not be surprising given the fact that superwash wool is treated so that the fibers have a completely smooth finish from removing the scales and then adding that polymer coating. So that smooth surface is going to reflect light a bit more than the scaly, uneven surface of untreated wool fiber. So superwash wool tends to look a little more glossy than natural wool. And it actually might feel a little more slippery when you knit or crochet with it than untreated wool feels. Okay, number 6, care. Caring for wool items is obviously going to be very different for natural wool versus superwash wool. As far as untreated wool, it's actually pretty easy to care for in general. It is inherently anti-static, so it picks up less dust and lint from the air than other materials do. It is far more efficient than other textiles at absorbing sweat and releasing it into the air before bacteria has a chance to develop and produce unpleasant body odor. And unlike other textile fibers, wool can be refreshed simply by putting it in the fresh air. So really you don't have to wash wool garments as often as garments made from other fibers. You probably don't have to wash wool unless you spill something on it. And then for untreated wool, you would want to hand wash it in tepid water and lay it flat to dry. Now with superwash wool, this is obviously going to allow you to put the item in the washing machine, but you should always check the yarn label to see how the manufacturer suggests laundering it. Sometimes even superwash wool is recommended to be hand washed, and a lot of times you'll see that they advise not to tumble dry, but to lay the item flat to dry. Superwash wool is easy care, but not zero care. Here are a few tips for laundering items made out of superwash wool. Number 1, use ample water. A lot of energy-efficient washing machines use low levels of water, but make sure there's enough water to allow the items to swish around. Second, in order to minimize stretching your items in the wash, use the gentle cycle and avoid putting heavy items like jeans and towels in with your knitted things. You might also want to put your superwash items into a mesh bag in the washing machine. That way, they'll be less likely to stretch out by getting spread out and rubbing up against heavy items that are also in there. Third, use a cleansing agent made especially for wool. Superwash wool may be safe to wash in the washing machine, but that doesn't mean it'll stand up to all the chemicals found in regular laundry detergents. Most laundry detergents contain enzymes designed to attack protein stains like eggs and blood, but wool itself is a protein, so those enzymes can damage the wool. So instead of a conventional detergent, use a wool wash that is especially made for wool. Last year I did a video where I tested out a bunch of different wool washes for their cleaning effectiveness, and I'll link that one down below in case you're interested in seeing that. But the overall winner was this one, the Laundress Wool and Cashmere Shampoo. It removed stains and cleaned better than any of the other wool washes I tested. All right, fourth, when it comes to drying, check the yarn label to see if the yarn can be tumble dried. As I already mentioned, the superwash process increases the yarn's elongation. When yarn is wet, it becomes heavy, and superwash yarn will stretch if given the opportunity. So to counteract any growth or sagging that might have happened during washing, you may be able to use the dryer to get the item to spring back into shape. I would say just be careful about it, and as a general rule, use low heat. This might prevent your projects from overstretching, but again, be really careful about it because the dryer is not always going to be a solution to correct stretched out items. Now, while we're on this topic of laundering, I thought it might be a good idea to do a quick review of laundering symbols that you'll often find on clothing tags as well as on yarn labels. Here are some washing symbols, which typically are icons that look like a basin of water. In this graphic, number 1 means machine wash, number 2 means hand wash, number 3 means do not wash, number 4 means dry clean only, and number 5 means do not dry clean. For dry cleaning, which is number 4, you'll usually see a letter like P or F inside the circle, and that refers to different solvents that can be used in the dry cleaning process. This is a second set of washing symbols that have to do with the wash water temperature. Number 1 with 1 dot means to wash in cold water in temperatures between 65 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Number 2 has 2 dots, meaning wash in warm water in temperatures between 85 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And number 3 with 3 dots means to wash in hot water in temperatures between 105 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes with the water temperature symbols, you will see a number instead of dots, and that number refers to the water temperature in degrees Celsius. This next set of washing symbols has to do with what cycle to set your washing machine on. Number 1 refers to a normal cycle. Number 2 has 1 line under the wash tub and means permanent press cycle. And number 3 has 2 lines under the wash tub and refers to a gentle or delicate cycle. Next, we have some laundering symbols for the dryer, and they're usually depicted as a square icon. Number 1 means it's okay to tumble dry. Number 2 means do not tumble dry. Number 3 means hang to dry. Number 4 means lay flat to dry. And number 5 means do not wring. On yarn labels, you'll probably see a lot of number 4 where it's recommended that you lay the item flat to dry. With superwash wool, you might see number 1, that it's okay to tumble dry, but don't assume that's always the case. Look at the label. It may say lay flat to dry. The next set of symbols, which are triangles, all have to do with bleach. Number 1, just a regular triangle, means it's okay to add chlorine bleach. Number 2, a triangle with an X through it, means don't use bleach. And number 3, a triangle with 2 diagonal lines, means use non-chlorine bleach only. Lastly, let's look at some ironing symbols, which are graphics that look like an iron. Number 1 has only 1 dot and means iron on low heat. Number 2 has 2 dots and means iron on medium heat. Number 3 has 3 dots and means iron on high heat. Number 4 means do not iron. And number 5, which has a little X below the iron symbol, means iron with no steam. So now let's look at an example of a yarn label to see these symbols in action. Here's the label from a hank of 100% superwash wool that I had in my stash. Let's see how you do with reading the laundering symbols. Okay, here's your quiz. The first symbol on the left looks like a wash tub with the number 30 inside it. Do you remember what that means? If you said this yarn is machine washable in water that is 30 degrees Celsius, then you are correct. And 30 degrees Celsius is about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So I would call it tepid water. It's not cold and it's not warm, but lukewarm or room temperature. Next on the label, you see a circle with a P inside of it. Do you remember what that stands for? If you said it means this yarn can be dry cleaned, then very good. And the P just stands for whatever the type of solvent that can be used. Moving to the right, there is a triangle with an X through it. And what do the triangle symbols represent? Excellent. If you said that triangle refers to bleach, so because it has an X through it, this yarn cannot be bleached. And really, you should never bleach wool yarn because the yarn will disintegrate. I mean, just think about the superwash process I've talked about. The wool is soaked in chlorine for 15 seconds, and in that small amount of time, all of its scales are removed. So yeah, chlorine is not a friend of wool. All right, the next symbol to the right is a square with a straight horizontal line in the middle of it. Do you remember what that one means? You're correct if you said that the squares represent drying instructions and this one means to lay flat to dry. Finally, the last symbol all the way over on the right should be pretty easy to remember. You got it, it's the ironing symbol. And this one has an X through it, so no ironing. Okay, so there's a little overview of how the superwash process can change natural wool fiber and a little refresher on how to read the laundering symbols on your yarn, whether it's superwash or not. Superwash wool can be a great alternative to unprocessed wool, but it does have its drawbacks and requires its own special care. One downside of superwash wool yarn is that it often costs more than untreated wool yarn. I've seen price differentials ranging from a couple of dollars more for a skein of superwash yarn all the way up to superwash costing double that of untreated wool yarn. I suppose there are a lot of factors that go into the pricing besides just the fact of the yarn being superwash or not, but the price difference is something to be aware of. One of the biggest problems with superwash wool, and one that has caused a lot of controversy, is the environmental impact of the process used to make it. Let me first say that the actual yarn itself is not toxic. So working with superwash wool yarn or making something out of it or wearing something made out of superwash wool is not harmful at all. There's no scientific evidence that exposure to superwash wool yarn is hazardous to a person's health. So people need not worry about health risks from knitting or crocheting with superwash yarn or wearing garments made out of superwash yarn. The issue is that the established chemical treatments, such as the Herkesett process, creates toxic wastewater. The amount of chlorine compounds in the discharged water from these factories is a concern. Unfortunately, the Herkesett method results in wastewater with high levels of adsorbable organic halogens known as AOX, which is a water pollutant that can be harmful to humans. In response to these environmental concerns, companies have been developing ways of removing the scales covering the wool fibers without using chlorine. I read several scientific journal articles outlining parts of these processes to try to get a grasp on these new technologies. One method, called NatureTex, is a plasma treatment developed in Germany which uses high voltage electricity to obtain the same results as Herkesett. Two electrodes create an energy field that reacts with the surface of the wool fiber and reduces the scales without damaging the fiber itself. So it basically burns off the cuticle scales from the wool fibers to make them smooth. It is considered environmentally friendly because it's a dry process. It doesn't use any water at all. It also doesn't use any chlorine or other volatile organic compounds, so there's no water or air contamination. And it doesn't require the application of a polymer or resin. Another new superwash process is called EXP, which is short for X-pollution. Instead of using chlorine, this process uses salt and hydrogen peroxide. The salt suppresses the swelling of the wool fibers, and the hydrogen peroxide enhances absorption of a biosynthetic polymer coating. Then, instead of a synthetic polymer, a polymer made out of chitosan, which is produced from shrimp shells, is deposited on the wool fibers to smooth them out. Another biopolymer is also being tested, and this one is made from sericin, which is produced by silkworms in the creation of silk. And this one shows good potential as well. In research, the EXP process has worked well for fine wools, but coarser wools still felt it a bit. But this process shows a lot of promise and is considerably better for the environment than the chlorine Hercocet method. No hazardous chemicals are needed, so water and air contamination are significantly reduced. In another approach to decontaminating the superwash process, researchers at a university in Malaysia are using bacteria to biodegrade the harmful chemicals in wastewater from the superwash process. In their tests, 87 to 92% of the chlorinated organic compound removal was achieved. There is also some emerging research using fungi and synthetic enzymes to do the same thing. My investigation into new superwash technologies uncovered a couple of other processes, one called EcoWash and the other is called Pure Wash. And these are apparently proprietary methods developed by different companies, so the actual processes don't seem to be publicly available, but they're advertised as organic and eco-friendly. I just wasn't able to confirm exactly how the wool is made machine washable in those. It may be one of the processes I just talked about, or it might be something completely different. Okay, so that's pretty much all the information I've been able to compile on superwash wool and the processes for making it. A lot of yarn today is made with superwash wool, and in surveying my stash of sock yarn, there's no doubt that almost all of it is superwash wool, mixed with a little bit of nylon. There's only a rare skein in there that isn't superwash. In other weights of yarn in my stash, the opposite is true. For example, I don't have much superwash worsted weight yarn or DK weight yarn. I have some, but not very much. Let's take a look at two skeins of yarn that are both from the same company, but one is superwash merino and the other is untreated. The turquoise one is 100% superwash and the lilac one is 100% untreated merino wool. Both are worsted weight and have exactly the same gauge listed on their labels, and that is 4.5 stitches per inch. But the recommended needle size for the superwash yarn is a US size 7, and the recommended needle size for the non-superwash yarn is a US size 8. So that is a 4.5 millimeter and a 5 millimeter needle. So it's suggesting a smaller needle size for the superwash yarn, which makes sense, so the stitches will be tighter and not grow as much. Feeling the yarns, while they're both very soft, I'd have to say that the turquoise one, which is superwash, is definitely softer than the lilac one. Most people find that superwash wool is softer than non-superwash wool, and that's another reason that a lot of people enjoy working with superwash wool more than untreated wool. So with all this being said, I'd like to leave you with the following thoughts. There are a lot of benefits to superwash wool. It's softer, it has a pretty luster, it's more durable and more absorbent, and it's easier to care for than untreated wool. The downsides are that superwash wool has less elasticity than untreated wool, so it tends to stretch out and sag. It's not as good at insulating and wicking away moisture as untreated wool. And there are environmental issues with traditional superwash processes, although some eco-friendly superwash processes are starting to be used. The thing is, you probably won't know which process was used on any particular yarn unless it says so on the label. It would be impossible to tell just by feeling the yarn. So whether or not you want to use superwash wool is an individual decision based on what's important to you. Like anything, there are pros and cons. I think it's best to be an informed consumer, to be aware of what superwash means. And then each one of us makes our own educated decision. And now I'd like to hear from you in the comments section below. So how important is superwash wool yarn to you? What are the characteristics that are most important to you? Have you used it? Have you used superwash yarn? What have you made with it? And how did it turn out? Did you have any problems with it growing or stretching out? Did you have any other experiences with it? Have you ever accidentally felted anything made out of non-treated wool yarn? Did you learn anything today? Maybe you didn't even know about superwash wool or how it's made. I'm always interested in hearing about your experiences and love reading your remarks. So feel free to leave a comment, question, or idea, or just say hi in the comment section below. And as always, I will link everything I talked about today in the information box right below this video. Just click on Show More to open up the box, and you'll see all the links there. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today, and I'll see you in the next video. And until then, remember to stay smart and have a sparkly week.